Welcome everyone to the 2021 California Forum for Diversity in Graduate Education. I'm Dr. Ximena Cid. I am currently the chair of the physics department at California State University, Dominguez Hills. I identify as Chicana and Yaqui, and my campus, Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, CSUDH, we sit on the traditional lands of the Tonga people, so I want to give thanks for the Tonga peoples for their continued protection of this space. I'm very excited to be talking with all of you today. I, as an undergrad at UC Berkeley, majored in astrophysics, and one of the first conferences that I attended was this Forum for Diversity in Graduate Education. It was one of the first times that I had ever been exposed to the idea of graduate school. I come from a family that is educated. I'm not the first in my family to attend college, but I'm one of the few in my families to pursue a STEM degree. Both my parents have graduate degrees. My father has a master's in printmaking from Sacramento State University, so another CSU alum. And my mother received her master's degree also from Sac State the same year that I received my Ph.D. So I want to tell you a little bit about where I come from and how I got to where I'm at now as the chair of the physics department. I started as an undergrad at UC Berkeley way back when, 2004. 2000, I graduated 2004, 2005. And I majored in astrophysics, and I didn't really know what I was doing when I was an undergraduate. I primarily had exposure to college with the idea that you had to take math and science like you did in high school. And so I started thinking that I was just going to major in music, but I was enrolled in math and science courses. I started with the CalBridge program, so I did have a cohort of friends that started with me, although very few of us were in STEM fields. I thought I wanted to be an engineer and primarily an aerospace engineer. They didn't have that at UC Berkeley, so I started doing mechanical engineering, taking those courses, and found out very quickly that that was not the path for me. I really didn't know how to utilize advising. So for all of you that are attending this conference, I highly recommend connecting with your campus advisors. They really have a wealth of information, and your department secretaries also have a tremendous amount of knowledge. And that's really where I got my advising, was my department secretary. So I started taking physics classes, and in order to take astrophysics classes, I had to take more math, more physics. I was really interested in space. And so by the time I got to my fourth year, I'd been taking all these classes, but had never really declared my major. And so I was getting these letters that I was going to get kicked out of school unless I declared my major. And I didn't know you had to do that. So again, I encourage you to talk with your advisors early. But I met with our secretary, and she sat me down and really worked through all the courses and showed me that I was on track to graduate with a degree in astrophysics within that next year. And so that's what I did. During my second and probably my second to last year, so probably my third and fourth year, or fourth and fifth year, I'm not really sure. It's all a little bit of a blur. I started doing research with the space science labs in the hills behind UC Berkeley. And my advisor, Dr. Janet Lumen, I'm very grateful that she was my advisor. She was very patient with me. She sent me to my first professional conference and really helped me define the kind of ideas that I had. And so she talked to me about graduate school. She really was the first to really break down, what does graduate school mean? Number one, if you're in a STEM field, most graduate programs are funded, fully funded, either through a TA position or an RA position. So if you're attending an institution that is not willing to pay your tuition, you should really reconsider your options. Now, this is for PhD terminal degrees. If it's a master's terminal degrees, like some of the CSUs, they should have some funding available for you as well. But if you apply to a PhD program as a master's student, you're likely not to get as much funding. So think about the PhD. But the last 2 years, I was doing research. I was sent to a summer school program for space physics, space plasmas. It was a program designed for first year graduate students. I was an undergrad, and so this was also a way that I started to really gain confidence in myself as a scientist and as a student. I didn't have a lot of confidence. I was working 2 jobs primarily the entire time I was an undergrad. And so I didn't really know what it was like to be a full-time student and what that possibility or what that would entail in terms of my ability to pay my bills and survive on my own. So I needed a lot of guidance during that time. And so I went to this program, talked with the other advisors that were there, and really got a better understanding, talked to the students. They were all first year graduate students, and really got an understanding of what it meant to be a graduate student. I also, that last year of undergrad, went to the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, the SACNAS conference. And that's also where the first time I ever met another Chicano physicist, astrophysicist. So I didn't really know that many students that were like me in undergrad. I knew Franklin Dollar, Dr. Dollar, who was in engineering physics at UC Berkeley. We were students together. He also started faculty the same year I started faculty. And so it's kind of come full circle. So the other piece of advice I have for you is to keep in touch with your friends, keep in touch with your peers. You never know where you're going to run into them again. But I went to SACNAS, and I also got a lot of advising, got a lot of insight into what the space, what the field is like. First time I really experienced someone that shared their connection of their culture and how that influenced them as a scientist. And that was really inspiring for me. Physics was always presented, astrophysics was always presented in this way that was leave your culture outside of the classroom. And so for me to have somebody that brought that in to the work that they were doing already in the professional field, that made a huge impact on how I saw myself. So I did study abroad my last year. I studied abroad twice in undergrad. I encourage you to do that as well. Getting a different global perspective changes how you see yourself in the world. And I think that's also extremely important in our globally connected world, especially in the tech world and in the science world, to be able to have that ability to understand different cultures is a benefit, not necessarily a disadvantage, which some people like to describe. But I studied abroad, and during that time I stayed in contact with Dr. Lopez, who I met at SACNAS and who I had heard about at this space physics summer school that I had gone to the year before as well. When I returned from studying abroad in Europe, from Italy, after 6 months, I went straight to Florida and did kind of like an REU program. It wasn't necessarily an REU in the sense that I was no longer an undergrad, I had graduated, but I did do a summer internship research-wise with his group in Florida. And at the end of that, he was like, you've already done your GREs, you've done your assessments, your grades are fine, you can start in 2 weeks, even though I hadn't applied. And that freaked me out and I didn't know what to do. I had just gotten done with 6 months of a whirlwind adventure in Europe, came home, went straight to Florida, and got a different perspective on what does it mean to be Latino. My family is very Chicano, and when I went to Florida, there's a lot more of the Caribbean islands. And so that Latino culture was very different. That was a little bit of an adjustment. But I wasn't ready, and I'm glad that I had enough sense of myself to say no. And even though it was very difficult, to say no to paid grad school and guaranteed admission, it was not the right time for me. I knew that if I had started, I would have quit and never finished. So I went back home, got, I don't even know how many jobs. I was temping, staff, office assistant for a couple, months here and there, because I didn't know how to apply for a tech job. Nobody had really done that kind of training with me, what kind of jobs I would qualify for after my bachelor's degree. And so here I was having this degree from, one of the best universities in the world, and not knowing how to apply to get an appropriate job. But during that time, I'm also grateful that I spent time in various fields back in education as well at a community college, which helped me understand what is it that I want to do. And so by the end of maybe March of that year, I had decided that, I wasn't done learning. I was getting bored with some of these jobs and I wanted to go back and further my education. And so I called Ramon Lopez up again. and say, okay, I'm ready now. Can I come back? Can I come to grad school? And he was fine. He was like, yes, we still have funding for you. Come. And I joined the group. We were there for about a year at Florida Institute of Technology, which was an institution designed for astronauts. So we were about 45 minutes south of Kennedy Space Center, and we had astronauts in our program. So it was more graduate school than it was undergrad. And that was really interesting to be able to spend time with professionals in space sciences as literally astronauts, and going through the content with their practical use in mind, but our theoretical use in mind as well. So that was a really interesting blend that year. Dr. Lopez got recruited to Texas and negotiated to move our group. And so 4 of his graduate students, myself included, after that first year that that had joined them in Florida, he had moved our group to the University of Texas at Arlington. And by that point, I had started doing physics education work. I was really interested in the teaching and learning of science. And in particular, I was really interested in understanding the ways in which we present information. So we were doing a study where we were looking at a solar event that impacts the magnetic field around Earth. And we were thinking about what kind of impact does this have on electric perturbations, right? So if we have electric and magnetic perturbations, so if you have a current that's being created and it's changing, you're going to develop a magnetic field. This things that we learn in our first year of our intro physics sequence. And what we were seeing was that a lot of graduate students couldn't understand this system. And when we presented it in a 3-dimensional system, a program, a computer program, everybody could get it. So that really impacted the ways in which I thought about how is it we learn and what is our mind doing to understand these ideas that are abstract in nature. And so that really pulled me out of the space plasmas part of my field and really thinking deeply about how is it that we teach and learn and provide access to knowledge. So I spent the rest of my graduate career, my PhD, thinking about the teaching and learning of physics. And I was the first student in our graduate program in Texas to complete a PhD with physics education as my focus. And I actually had to do studies to show our department that this was still a physics subfield. So if we want to think deeply about why is quantum mechanics so difficult, or what is it about the ways in which we're presented it, we should have a solid understanding of quantum mechanics in order to understand student replies or student responses. And so I spent time really developing, going through that as the first student with the PER focus, and also convincing my faculty. That really developed a different sense of confidence in myself as well, because I had to go through department meetings and show how this data is very similar to other subfields of physics. And so that was a way in which that also developed my sense of confidence. I think I was the first Latinx person to graduate with a PhD in physics from our department. I certainly was the first Indigenous person to graduate with a PhD in physics from that department as well. I then transitioned into a full-time permanent faculty job at a community college in Texas. And while I was there, I got an opportunity to do a postdoc, which is after your PhD, specifically about research. So I met with my dean at the community college and discussed, what my opportunities were. And she was really supportive and really encouraged me to leave the tenure track job and then go do a research position. And that was also a challenge for me because at that time, I didn't really understand the academic job market. I didn't realize that tenure track jobs are faculty positions are sometimes a challenge to come by, especially in places that you want to be in geographically. And so in order to process leaving a tenure track faculty job, I had to then think about, well, what is the benefit that this postdoc is going to provide in terms of opportunity. The postdoc was back on the West Coast, which is where most of my family is from. So I no longer had to worry about time changes, and thinking about calling my family and talking with my family. So I decided to take the postdoc job in Seattle, Washington, the University of Washington. And it was an interesting time for me. I don't think I fit well with that group. I did spend 3 years with that group, but I don't think I fit well with that group. And it was a challenging time in terms of thinking about what is it I want to do with my life? What is it what I want to do with my career? And how does my culture interact with my professional self? I did a lot of soul searching in that position. I did a lot of work with Indigenous communities while I was up in Seattle. I did a lot of work with Latinx communities. I did a lot of work with different professional organizations. And having all of those things working together in some ways, but also competing in other ways, it was a very big challenge, mentally, emotionally, physically. And so I did end up leaving that position and then still questioning, do I want to be an academic still? Do I want to think about the hustle of writing grants? Do I want to do research? Do I want to teach? Teaching is part of my field, at least the way that I pursue it. So I did want to engage with that more. I did have experience from being a faculty member with the community college, but I was interested in getting back to California, which is where my family is from. And so I went on the job market. I started applying to faculty jobs. I went on quite a few interviews. I applied to faculty jobs every single year that I was a postdoc. I was discouraged from doing that, but it also gave me a lot of experience. So by the time I was actually ready to really leave and pursue a faculty job, I actually had experience with interviewing and what that was like. I highly encourage all of you at this point in your career to create a big plan picture, but also don't be so rigid about it. There are opportunities that come that we have no idea about. And 5 years is a big chunk of time. Life happens, right? A lot of life happens in undergrad, 4, 5, 6 years that you are a student. And the same thing's going to happen when you're a graduate student. And the same thing's going to happen at every step of your career. What I've learned is that every year that I'm in a new position, that first year is always going to be the most challenging. You're adjusting to a new space, you're adjusting to a new environment, you're adjusting to new levels of expectations. Time management is always, always, always going to shift and change, and it's always going to be a skill set that you are going to be working at. And so I encourage you to do that. I encourage all of you to seek out psychological services if you need support for your mental health. Our mental health is just as important as our physical health. So I encourage all of you to utilize the resources that you have available to you as students for that. I still do, even as a career professional person. I talk with my students a lot as the chair in the preparation of what our field is like. For my campus, I chose it specifically because I was interested in working with a more diverse student group, students that reflected my personal background. So CSUDH is an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution. We're also an MSI, Minority Serving Institution. And so I was very strategic about the places that I applied to so that I could work with the populations that I wanted to. I'd been part of elite institutions my whole professional career, academic career. And it was very isolating. And so at this point, I wanted to re-engage with students that I felt personal connections with. So what I do now is I teach my students who want to go into the Harvards or the Berkeleys or the Yales, how to prepare them for these spaces where they might find themselves as one of few or the only one in the room. But I have to be very careful about not scaring them. I think we all have the opportunity to engage in a work that sparks our curiosity and drives our inner ideas, inner creativity. And so I think that if we're all prepared by understanding tools, creating the tools that we have access to, utilizing your networks, I want to help them do that. I prepare our students to do research and present in national conferences. We take students to the SACNAS conference every year. We've taken students to the American Association of Physics Teachers Conference, the American Physical Society. There's all kinds of different professional societies that I take my students to their national conferences. I've also been a board member with the National Society of Hispanic physicist, and while I was a board member with NSHP, I organized Dia de la Física, Day of Physics, for 4 years in conjunction with the SACNAS conference. So we moved to a different university every year, brought students, and it grew. That was also a good motivation for me to engage with my communities. And just recently, 2020, we created and founded the Society of Indigenous Physicists. And I think with everything that happened this past 18 months with COVID, with racialized violence against the Black community, with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, this pandemic that we have where our Indigenous women and girls and two-spirits are subjected to sexual violence. If we're not acknowledging the things that are happening within our communities, then we're not acknowledging how that affects us in our professional lives. And so we formed the Society of Indigenous Physicists to really create a more solidified network of Indigenous peoples within physics, space science, and industry. And so my professional societies, NSHP, SIP, Society of Black Physicists, National Society of Black Physicists, which I've engaged with often, and then my professional physics societies, all of these things help create the space that I wanted as a professional. And now as the chair, I am likely the first Indigenous person to chair a physics department in the country. I'm very proud of that, but I'm also, I speak often nationally about what does it mean to be the first, especially with Indigenous knowledge. Our peoples have existed in these continents with astronomical knowledge for millennia. And yet a lot of that isn't included in our national STEM histories that we are taught in our educational systems. And so I think now at this point in my career, I have a position where I can engage in work that brings our communities into these spaces, reminds our communities that these are not new spaces for us. And I think that simple fact allows us to then see ourselves in these spaces and to not try to imagine what could be, but to know that we have been and we will continue to be. So I'm really excited to share just a little piece of who I am with all of you. It is just a short, brief message, and I do encourage all of you to engage with this conference full-heartedly. It is hard with virtual conferences, but spend time making connections with people, spend time utilizing the skills that are developed and shared with you through these workshops. Spend time asking the questions, right? All of us have questions and sometimes we get a little too scared to ask them. So I encourage you to ask the questions that you have. This is a safe space for you to do so. And so I hope you all enjoy this conference. I hope you all engage in a meaningful way. And I hope you all continue to see yourselves thriving in these STEM spaces in your graduate careers. If you're interested in reaching out to me, xcid@csudh.edu is my contact info. I am like I said, I'm the chair of the physics department at California State University, Dominguez Hills, Dr. Ximena Cid. Thank you so much. Enjoy your conference.